Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the second part of Line of the Sun. The second part takes primarily in the building in Paterson, New Jersey, where the family has now migrated to and settled. And we see how the building represents belonging differently for these different characters. So for Rafael, the father, it's supposed to be just a temporary space of arrival. For Ramona, it becomes a home away from home, home being Puerto Rico, where her and the other women in the building try to recreate Puerto Rico within the building. And for Marisol, it's a space of partial belonging. She appreciates some of the cultural elements of it, but she also feels limited by it and wants more. We also see how race is experienced differently, especially for Rafael, because of his fair skin, which protects him from outright racism, the kind that is felt by other members of his family that are darker skinned, like his wife and his daughter. Rafael's fair skin also allows him to aspire to an American assimilation. He only wants the family to shop at American grocery stores. He keeps bringing up moving to a house in the suburbs. And his job in the Navy also provides him and the family with a higher class status, which also creates a desire for a middle-class suburban lifestyle. And in the reading, she talks about the stain, or as she calls it, la mancha, the signs of being other racially that she notices they carry in a way. And the quote says, "It was la mancha, that sign of the wetback, the stain that has little to do with the color of our skin, because some of us are as white as our American neighbors. And it was the frightened rabbit look in our eyes and our unending awe of anything new or foreign that identified us as the newcomer." So it wasn't just about skin color that racialized them as other, but all these other nuanced ways in which they're different that make them easily identified as foreign or as not really American. We also see a lot of gendered and cultural belonging, especially for the women in our building. Whereas, for instance, for Ramona, it was a space that felt safe and familiar to her. As stated in this quote, "Coming in from shopping, my mother would close her eyes and breathe deeply. It was both a sigh of relief where the city streets made her anxious and a taking in of familiar smells." And there's multiple moments in this part of the text where we see this kind of description of the building being sort of this safe space, so to speak, for Ramona and the other women like her. Women also saw the building as a space where they could recreate and uphold Puerto Rican culture and traditions. They had the quote illusion that all could be kept the same within the family as it had been on the island, and decorated their households with every artifact that enhanced the fantasy. And these were Marisol's observations, right? She sort of criticizes sort of this romantic, nostalgic way in which the women in the building try their best, right, to uphold their lives in Paterson, New Jersey, to be as close to what they were like back in Puerto Rico. But for Marisol, we see sort of a different, more complicated a struggle with belonging. She, on the one hand, sees her mother as representing a foreignness that she's desperately trying to avoid. As we see in this quote, "On the streets of Paterson, my mother seemed an alien and a refugee. And as I grew to identify with the elements she feared, I dreaded walking with her, a human billboard advertising her paranoia in a foreign language." We also see how she describes her mother the one day that she appears at her school, and she describes her and the way she looks, the way she dresses, as so completely foreign and exotic compared to the sort of middle-class mainstream American image of women that she sort of observes and has around her, particularly with the other families that are represented in the school she attends. For Guzman, however, he becomes a model of rebellion against existing forms of belonging when he arrives to the building, but also based on the stories that she's grown up hearing about him. When Ramona spoke of his rebellious childhood, I secretly thrilled at his defiance of the adults, whom I was just beginning to resent. At 13, I was being counseled in humble acceptance of a destiny I had not chosen for myself. exile, or worse, homelessness. I was already very much aware of the fact that I fit into neither the white middle-class world of my classmates at St. Jerome's, nor the exclusive club of El Building's expatriates. So she's critical of sort of the nostalgic kind of living within which the women in the building experience or recreate their sense of belonging there. But she also is aware that she doesn't fully belong into the world that is modeled for her by her peers at St. Jerome's. We also see her experience how whites will racialize her as other when she's invited to a white friend's house for a Christmas dinner, becomes painfully aware of all the ways she would never fit into the white middle class world. And she expresses that she wanted more than anything to believe that people like the Rosellis could accept me as one of their own. However, no matter how much she wants to believe that, she experiences how the family treats her as a reminder that that is not ever really going to happen for her. While she disparages the building and its romantic nostalgia, she herself falls at times for nostalgia for the island, stating, talking with my uncle, listening to stories about his life on the island, and hearing Ramona's constant rhapsodizing about that tropical paradise all conspired to make me feel deprived. I should have grown up there. I should have been able to play in emerald green pastures, to eat sweet bananas right off the trees, to learn about life from the women who were strong and wise, like the fabled Mama Cielo. So she does recognize and realize that there's something she has missed from having from her family having to migrate to the United States, and desires, right, or has a wish for having had a different life or potential different life for herself, at least culturally, or at least from having a sense of belonging, if she had been able to grow up on the island. As she engages with the goings on in the building towards the latter part of the book, the spiritist meeting that the women are organizing, the male workers organizing, and the police surveillance that starts happening, she becomes more conscious of the elusiveness of ever fitting into the mainstream world. As she states, I went to school enveloped in the light of another world. There I was petted and praised by the nuns for my good grades and my humble demeanor, which was nothing more than fear of being exposed for the total alien I felt myself to be in that environment of discipline and order. So she starts realizing in a way that the foreignness, the alienness that her mother represents to her by the way she physically looks, she's not so far removed from that, right? She feels like she really is an alien that's about to be discovered by the people at her school, and realizing that however critical she might be of what is going on in her building, that she is also a part of it, right? Guzman continues on this part of the novel to exist in the margins. You see him go from farm worker prisoner, as he described his experience at the strawberry farm, to a subway dweller. In this quote where he says he became a subway warrior, his senses attuned to the dark look in a pervert's eye, the nervous hands of the amateur mugger, and the deviousness of the pickpocket. It was his survival course. So in the margins of the farm and the subway, he learned certain skill sets that we see later on become important when it comes time to try to save the family from the impending danger that's coming to them in the building. But also he passes on these some of these skill sets to his niece, Marisol. We also see how Guzman parallels the experience of Franco el Loco from the first part of the novel, when he's stabbed because of his affair with a woman in New York City. And so he starts taking on some of the characteristics of some of the other marginal characters that we had seen when he was still in the town of Salud. He's also marginalized from the male space of the building because he's confined to a bed while recovering from his stab wound. So even though all the men in the building are participating in organizing the workers' strike and being vigilant on what the police are doing. He's marginal from those goings-ons as well, because he has to stay in bed and recuperate from his wound. And so he ends up recruiting Marisol to kind of be his spy, right? So that's how he becomes aware of what is going on. Ultimately, Guzman returns to the island and falls in love with La Cabra's daughter, Sarita, who looks exactly like her. But it also becomes really interesting and ironic in a way, because she is even more religious, more pious, more of a Catholic martyr than the Holy Rosary Society was at the beginning of the novel. As Marisol continues to develop, we see her learning new models for belonging that she starts incorporating into her own identity. From Guzman, she learns the tricks of the trade from him, how to rebel, how to prepare for escape, how not to fear anything or anyone. And we see how these skill sets become really important and useful for her at the end, after the fire happens in our building. Language also, she realizes, a tool of belonging for her. She serves as an interpreter for Ramona, helping her navigate the bureaucracy after the fire and how to reach her father, who was deployed at the time. And this quote is really significant in terms of her own development and trying to figure out a belonging for herself. Once again, I found myself in the role of interpreter of the world for my mother, who after all these years still believed that it operated like an extended family. In times of need or tragedy, people naturally came to your rescue. She never quite understood why I had to make 10 phone calls before we got an appointment with the man from the Navy office. She shook her head in disbelief when she was told it would be days before the paperwork was completed and Rafael could come home. I told her where to sign and answered most questions without consulting her. I learned something during those days. Though I would always carry my island heritage on my back like a snail, I belonged in the world of phones, offices, concrete buildings, and the English language. So this experience really opens her mind to what kind of space she can have in terms of belonging, right? That she realizes that the island and her island heritage and her Puerto Rican cultural background is always going to be a part of her, right? That regardless of what her future holds, that is her past, that is where she comes from, that is where her family comes from, and that is a foundational part of who she is. But she also realizes that she doesn't belong in the world of her mother, but that there is this world, right, outside of her building, in the part of the mainstream world, that she also belongs to, right, and has a right to. And she particularly sees this through her skills in terms of language, right, that she's able to access certain things in the mainstream world that are difficult for her mother to access and understand, because she does speak English, right, because she does have a facility with the language. In the end, we see after the fire of the building that Rafael finally gets his wish, and they do end up getting a home in the suburbs. But we also see, while they're searching for a home in the suburbs, that they're not completely accepted in that realm either. So the suburban space becomes a space of both belonging and unbelonging. So while Ramona is in Puerto Rico, Rafael and Marisol take over, finding and creating a new family home in middle-class suburbia. For Ramona, the suburban house appears as a gilded cage in which she'll feel imprisoned, right? It is not a building. She's not going to have the sense of community that she had there, right? And so as much as Marisol and Rafael try to recreate a sense of home for her there, it never really becomes that for her. Storytelling as belonging, though, becomes sort of a replacement, right, for Ramon and Marisol, where they're able to recreate a sense of women's community in the kitchen table, sharing stories, just as Ramona had done with the other women in the building. And we had seen in that situation how Marisol often felt excluded from that community, right, because she wasn't, sort of one of the women. Here in suburbia now, the two women, right, mother and daughter, are able to sort of share that space and kind of recreate that sense of women's community in the kitchen table through, once again, the stories of Guzman. For Marisol, the suburban home is where she will be able to claim a space for her new writing and creativity, as we see her, in a way, use a story to be able to claim the particular space she wanted in the house. But she also acknowledges it will be the space of their quote unquote newest exile. So some critics have read this moment as evidence of Ortiz Coffer's affirmation of an Americanized individualist identity. However, Marisol does not see their suburban home as a symbol of acquiring full citizenship or belonging in the United States. She describes this new stage in their lives as our newest exile, asserting that it will not only be her mother who finds the space alienating, but really it's going to be a new exile for all of them, right? It's going to be a new experience of navigating belonging for themselves. So she's aware that even though in this new space of suburbia, or at least in this new house, she's able to have a space of her own. It becomes a space where she's able to write and explore her creativity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that she is fully now accepted or immersed into American culture or into the American mainstream, right? It is still going to be a space where they are going to always be aware of their difference. And it'll be a new space in which they will have to navigate these differences. So herein ends the lecture for this week. I really look forward to seeing your comments on the discussion post. There's quite a number of questions there that I posted about these topics and others. So I look forward to reading your comments. Have a wonderful week.